The European single market, or internal market, is a single market that seeks to guarantee the free movement of goods, capital, services, and people, the four freedoms, within the European Union. The market encompasses the EU's 28 member states, and has been extended, with exceptions, to Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway through the Agreement on the European Economic Area and to Switzerland through bilateral treaties. The market is intended to be conducive to increased competition, increased specialisation, larger economies of scale, allowing goods and factors of production to move to the area where they are most valued, thus improving the efficiency of the allocation of resources. It is also intended to drive economic integration, whereby the once separate economies of the member states become integrated within a single EU-wide economy. Half of the trade in goods within the EU is covered by legislation harmonized by the EU. The creation of the internal market as a seamless, single market is an ongoing process, with the integration of the service industries still containing gaps. It also has an increasing international element, with the market represented as one in international trade negotiations. History. One of the original core objectives of the European Economic Community was the development of a common market offering free movement of goods, service, people and capital. Free movement of goods was established in principle through the customs union between its then 6 member states. However, the EEC struggled to enforce a single market due to the absence of strong decision-making structures. It was difficult to remove intangible barriers with mutual recognition of standards and common regulations due to protectionist attitudes. In the 1980s, when the economy of the EEC began to lag behind the rest of the developed world, the Delors Commission took the initiative to attempt to relaunch the common market, publishing a white paper in 1985 identifying 300 measures to be addressed in order to complete a single market. The white paper was well received and led to the adoption of the Single European Act, a treaty which reformed the decision-making mechanisms of the EEC and set a deadline of the 31st of December 1992 for the completion of a single market. In the end, it was launched on the 1st of January 1993. The new approach, pioneered by the Delors Commission, combined positive and negative integration, relying upon minimum rather than exhaustive harmonization. Negative integration consists of prohibitions imposed on member states of discriminatory behavior and other restrictive practices. Positive integration consists in approximation of laws and standards. Especially important in this respect is the adoption of harmonizing legislation under Article 114 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. The Commission also relied upon the European Court of Justice's treaties.The jurisprudence, under which member states were obliged to recognize goods which had been legally produced in another member state, unless the member state could justify the restriction by reference to a mandatory requirement. Harmonization would only be used to overcome barriers created by trade restrictions which survived the CASIS mandatory requirements test, and to ensure essential standards where there was a risk of a race to the bottom. Thus, harmonization was largely used to ensure basic health and safety standards were met. By 1992, about 90% of the issues had been resolved, and in the same year the Maastricht Treaty set about to create an economic and monetary union as the next stage of integration. Work on freedom for services did take longer, and was the last freedom to be implemented, mainly through the Posting of Workers Directive and the Directive on Services in the Internal Market. In 1997, the Amsterdam Treaty abolished physical barriers across the internal market by incorporating the Schengen area within the competences of the EU. The Schengen Agreement implements the abolition of border controls between most member states, common rules on visas, and police and judicial cooperation. Even as the Lisbon Treaty came into force in 2009, however, some areas pertaining parts of the four freedoms had not yet been completely open. Those, along with further work on the economic and monetary union, would see the EU move further to a European home market. Free movement of goods, customs duties and taxation. The European Union is also a customs union. This means that member states have removed customs barriers between themselves and introduced a common customs policy towards other countries. The overall purpose of the duties is to ensure normal conditions of competition and to remove all restrictions of a fiscal nature capable of hindering the free movement of goods within the common market. By agreement between the Union and the states concerned, Andorra, Monaco, San Marino and Turkey also participate in the EU Customs Union. Customs duties. Article 30 TFEU prohibits member states from levying any duties on goods crossing a border, both goods produced within the EU and those produced outside. Once a good has been imported into the EU from a third country and the appropriate customs duty paid, Article 29 TFEU dictates that it shall then be considered to be in free circulation between the member states. Neither the purpose of the charge nor its name in domestic law is relevant. Since the Single European Act, there can be no systematic customs controls at the borders of member states. The emphasis is on post-import audit controls and risk analysis. Physical controls of imports and exports now occur at traders' premises, rather than at the territorial borders. Charges having equivalent effect to customs duties. Article 30 of the TFEU prohibits not only customs duties but also charges having equivalent effect. The European Court of Justice defined charge having equivalent effect in Commission v. Italy. NY pecuniary charge, however small and whatever its designation and mode of application, which is imposed unilaterally on domestic or foreign goods by reason of the fact that they cross a frontier, and which is not a customs duty in the strict sense, constitutes a charge having equivalent effect, even if it is not imposed for the benefit of the state, is not discriminatory or protective in effect, and if the product on which the charge is imposed is not in competition with any domestic product. A charge is a customs duty if it is proportionate to the value of the goods. If it is proportionate to the quantity, it is a charge having equivalent effect to a customs duty. There are three exceptions to the prohibition on charges imposed when goods cross a border, listed in Case 1887 Commission v. Germany. A charge is not a customs duty, a charge having equivalent effect if it relates to a general system of internal dues applied systematically and in accordance with the same criteria to domestic products and imported products alike. If it constitutes payment for a service in fact rendered to the economic operator of a sum in proportion to the service, or subject to certain conditions, if it attaches to inspections carried out to fulfill obligations imposed by union law. Taxation. Article 110 of the TFEU provides, no member state shall impose, directly or indirectly, on the products of other member states any internal taxation of any kind in excess of that imposed directly or indirectly on similar domestic products. Furthermore, no member state shall impose on the products of other member states any internal taxation of such a nature as to afford indirect protection to other products. In the taxation of rum case, the ECJ stated that the court has consistently held that the purpose of Article 90 EC as a whole is to ensure the free movement of goods between the member states under normal conditions of competition. by eliminating all forms of protection which might result from the application of discriminatory internal taxation against products from other member states, and to guarantee absolute neutrality of internal taxation as regards competition between domestic and imported products. Quantitative and equivalent restrictions. Free movement of goods within the European Union is achieved by customs union and the principle of non-discrimination. The EU manages imports from non-member states. Duties between member states are prohibited and imports circulate freely. In addition, under the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, Article 34, quantitative restrictions on imports and all measures having equivalent effect shall be prohibited between member states. As in Procure du Roi v Dassenville, the Court of Justice held that this rule meant all trading rules that are enacted by member states which could hinder trade, directly or indirectly, actually or potentially, would be caught by Article 34. This meant that a Belgian law requiring Scotch whisky imports to have a certificate of origin was unlikely to be lawful. It discriminated against parallel importers like Mr. Dassenville, who could not get certificates from authorities in France, where they bought the Scotch. This wide test, to determine what could potentially be an unlawful restriction on trade, applies equally to actions by quasi-government bodies, such as the former Irish company that had government appointees. It also means states can be responsible for private actors. For instance, in Commission v France, French farmer vigilantes were continually sabotaging shipments of Spanish strawberries, and even Belgian tomato imports. France was liable for these hindrances to trade because the authorities manifestly and persistently abstained from preventing the sabotage. Generally speaking, if a member state has laws or practices that directly discriminate against imports, then it must be justified under Article 36. The justifications include public morality, policy or security, protection of health and life of humans, animals or plants, national treasures, or of artistic, historic or archaeological value, and industrial and commercial property. In addition, although not clearly listed, environmental protection can justify restrictions on trade as an overriding requirement derived from TFEU Article 11. More generally, it has been increasingly acknowledged that fundamental human rights should take priority over all trade rules. So, in Schmidberger v. Austria, the Court of Justice held that Austria did not infringe Article 34 by failing to ban a protest that blocked heavy traffic passing over the A13 Brenner Autobahn en route to Italy. Although many companies, including Mr. Schmidberger's German undertaking, were prevented from trading, the Court of Justice reasoned that freedom of association is one of the fundamental pillars of a democratic society, against which the free movement of goods had to be balanced, and was probably subordinate. If a member state does appeal to the Article 36 justification, the measures it takes have to be applied proportionately. This means the rule must pursue a legitimate aim and be suitable to achieve the aim, be necessary, so that a less restrictive measure could not achieve the same result, and be reasonable in balancing the interests of free trade with interests in Article 36. Often rules apply to all goods neutrally, but may have a greater practical effect on imports than domestic products. For such indirect discriminatory measures, the Court of Justice has developed more justifications, either those in Article 36, or additional, mandatory, or overriding a requirement such as consumer protection, improving labor standards, protecting the environment, press diversity, fairness openness in commerce, and more. The categories are not closed. In the most famous case Central v. Bundesmonopol für Brandwein, the Court of Justice found that a German law requiring all spirits and liqueurs to have a minimum alcohol content of 25% was contrary to TFEU Article 34, because it had a greater negative effect on imports. German liqueurs were over 25% alcohol, but Cassis-de Dijon, which Central wished to import from France, only had 15 to 20% alcohol. The Court of Justice rejected the German government's arguments that the measure proportionately protected public health under TFEU Article 36, because stronger beverages were available and adequate labeling would be enough for consumers to understand what they bought. This rule primarily applies to requirements about a product's content or packaging. In Walter Lebensmittelwerke v. der SMEDTPVBA, the Court of Justice found that a Belgian law requiring all margarine to be in cube-shaped packages infringed Article 34, and was not justified by the pursuit of consumer protection. The argument that Belgians would believe it was butter if it was not cube-shaped was disproportionate. It would considerably exceed the requirements of the object in view, and labeling would protect consumers just as effectively. In a 2003 case, Commission v. Italy, Italian law required that cocoa products that included other vegetable fats could not be labeled as chocolate. It had to be chocolate substitute. All Italian chocolate was made from cocoa butter alone, but British, Danish and Irish manufacturers used other vegetable fats. They claimed the law infringed Article 34. The Court of Justice held that the low content of vegetable fat did not justify a chocolate substitute label. This was derogatory in the consumer's eyes. A neutral and objective statement was enough to protect consumers. If member states place considerable obstacles on the use of a product, this can also infringe Article 34. So, in a 2009 case, Commission v. Italy, the Court of Justice held that an Italian law prohibiting motorcycles or mopeds pulling trailers infringed Article 34. Again, the law applied neutrally to everyone, but disproportionately affected importers because Italian companies did not make trailers. This was not a product requirement, but the court reasoned that the prohibition would deter people from buying it. It would have a considerable influence on the behavior of consumers that affects the access of that product to the market. It would require justification under Article 36, or as a mandatory requirement. In contrast to product requirements or other laws that hinder market access, the Court of Justice developed a presumption that selling arrangements would be presumed to not fall into TFEU Article 34, if they applied equally to all sellers and affected them in the same manner. In fact, in Kekenmidwa, two importers claimed that the prosecution under a French competition law, which prevented them selling pig and beer under wholesale price, was unlawful. The aim of the law was to prevent cutthroat competition, not to hinder trade. The Court of Justice held, as in law and in fact, it was an equally applicable selling arrangement. It was outside the scope of Article 34, and so did not need to be justified. Selling arrangements can be held to have an unequal effect, in fact, particularly where traders from another member state are seeking to break into the market. But there are restrictions on advertising and marketing. In Konsumentombudsmannen and v. Agostini, the Court of Justice reviewed Swedish bans on advertising to children under age 12, and misleading commercials for skincare products. While the bans have remained, the court emphasized that complete marketing bans could be disproportionate if advertising were the only effective form of promotion enabling to penetrate the market. In Consument Ombudsman and v. Gourmet AB, the court suggested that a total ban for advertising alcohol on the radio, TV and in magazines could fall within Article 34, where advertising was the only way for sellers to overcome consumers' traditional social practices and local habits and customs to buy the products. But again, the national courts would decide whether it was justified under Article 36 to protect public health. Under the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, the EU harmonized restrictions on marketing and advertising to forbid conduct that distorts average consumer behavior, is misleading or aggressive, and sets out a list of examples that count as unfair. Increasingly, states have to give mutual recognition to each other's standards of regulation, while the EU has attempted to harmonize minimum ideals of best practice. The attempt to raise standards is hoped to avoid a regulatory race to the bottom, while allowing consumers access to goods from around the continent. Free movement of capital. Free movement of capital was traditionally seen as the fourth freedom, after goods, workers and persons, services and establishment. The original Treaty of Rome required that restrictions on free capital flows only be removed to the extent necessary for the common market. For the Treaty of Maastricht, now in TFEU Article 63, all restrictions on the movement of capital between member states and between member states and third countries shall be prohibited. This means capital controls of various kinds are prohibited, including limits on buying currency, limits on buying company shares of financial assets, or government approval requirements for foreign investment. By contrast, taxation of capital, including corporate tax, capital gains tax and financial transaction tax, are not affected so long as they do not discriminate by nationality. According to the Capital Movement Directive 1988, Annex I, 13 categories of capital which must move free are covered. In BAAR's Inspecteur der Belasting and particularly in the Court of Justice held that for investments in companies, the capital rules, rather than freedom of establishment rules, were engaged if an investment did not enable a definite influence through shareholder voting or other rights by the investor. That case held a Dutch Wealth Tax Act 1964 unjustifiably exempted Dutch investments, but not Mr. Bouw's investments in an Irish company, from the tax. The wealth tax, or exemptions, had to be applied equally. On the other hand, TFEU Article 65 does not prevent taxes that distinguish taxpayers based on the residence or the location of an investment, or any measures to prevent tax evasion, apart from tax cases largely following from the opinions of Advocate General Maduro. A series of cases held that government-owned golden shares were unlawful. In Commission v. Germany, the Commission claimed the German Volkswagen Act 1960 violated Article 63, in that Section 2 restricted any party having voting rights exceeding 20% of the company, and Section 4 allowed a minority of 20% of shares held by the Lower Saxony government to block any decisions. Although this was not an impediment to actual purchase of shares, or receipt of dividends by any shareholder, the Court of Justice's her chamber agreed that it was disproportionate for the government's stated aim of protecting workers and minority shareholders. Similarly, in Commission v. Portugal, the Court of Justice held that Portugal infringed free movement of capital by retaining golden shares in Portugal Telecom that enabled disproportionate voting rights, by creating a deterrent effect on portfolio investments and redoing the attractiveness of an investment. This suggested the court's preference that a government, if it sought public ownership or control, should nationalize in full the desired proportion of a company in line with TFEU Article 345. Capital within the EU may be transferred in any amount from one country to another, All intra-EU transfers in euro are considered as domestic payments and bear the corresponding domestic transfer costs. This includes all member states of the EU, even those outside the eurozone, providing the transactions are carried out in euro. Credit, debit card charging and ATM withdrawals within the eurozone are also charged as domestic. However, paper-based payment orders, like checks, have not been standardized, so these are still domestic-based. The ECB has also set up a clearing system target for large euro transactions. The final stage of completely free movement of capital was thought to require a single currency and monetary policy, eliminating the transaction costs and fluctuations of currency exchange. Following a report of the Delors Commission in 1988, the Treaty of Maastricht made economic and monetary union an objective. First, by completing the internal market, second, by creating a European system of central banks to coordinate common monetary policy, and third, by locking exchange rates and introducing a single currency, the euro. Today, 19 member states have adopted the euro, while 9 member states have either determined to opt out or their accession has been delayed, particularly since the eurozone crisis. According to TFEU Articles 119 and 127, the objective of the European Central Bank and other central banks ought to be price stability. This has been criticized for apparently being superior to the objective of full employment in the Treaty on European Union Article 3.